Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I am Kris. This is continuing kind of a president's series. This is Herbert Hoover, Beyond the Great Depression. Click on that thumbs up. The Great Purge, Stalin's Darkest Moments. Interesting. Forgotten History. I've never covered his videos, but a lot of things he does is most corrupt series, and it's like every single person I think that's ever lived. So I don't really do any of those. Subscribe to the channel. Sorry, thanks button. Click on that. Donate. Request a video. Your name sponsors that video. Been to Herbert Hoover's house. Very small. Very tiny. In his museum. That's the word. In his museum, he has a chunk of the Berlin Wall, which is very cool. I touched it. Shh, you're not supposed to. You're not supposed to touch it. That was a lie, by the way. If his museum's here, I was totally goofing, even though I have a picture that I touched it. But we'll just keep that between us. All right, let's get into it.
Imagine you were asked to describe the...
Oh, sorry. His home... If you stand at the front door and you take three big steps, you got to be a guy. I apologize. You got to have long legs, 3 big man steps. You can go from the front door to the back door of the house. It is it's like basically 2 rooms, like living room, kitchen. Oh, I'm phasing. Come on, let's go. There you go. It'd be like a living room, kitchen on one side and then a bedroom on the other. And that was it. And he is buried a quarter mile behind his house. There's a little walkway and the trees are cut. Oh, come on, really? And there's trees have been cut. And you can see an unobstructed view from the cradle to the grave, which is what he wanted. So you can stand at the grave, see the house from the grave.
Perfect candidate for president. What qualities would you pick? Maybe you'd want them to be a scientist, someone who bases policy on evidence. Maybe you'd want them to be a great humanitarian or a business leader or to understand the lives of ordinary folk. If that's the case, then all we have to say to you is be careful what you wish for. In 1928, Americans really did elect a man with all those great qualities and many more. His name was Herbert Hoover, and he was one of the worst presidents in US history. Prior to 1928, the idea of a Hoover presidency...
He was a great human being, great humanitarian. Yeah. I'm probably going to nitpick some things he says here and there, but go for it.
Would have seemed a utopia. As a self-made businessman, Hoover had saved millions of lives in World War I through famine relief. Later, he helped America through one of its worst ever natural disasters. Had he died then, he would still be remembered as a great humanitarian. Instead, his name is forever to be linked to the Great Depression, a crisis that he fought to overcome, only to be consumed by it.
Which, it wasn't necessarily his fault, by the way. He saw it coming, didn't do enough to thwart it off, because he served under Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge was a vice president under James Harding. Harding died. Coolidge gets in, then gets reelected. Has Herbert Hoover on his staff, but he calls him the Wonder Boy. And he just doesn't care about what Hoover has to say about things. And Hoover's like, there's going to be a recession if we keep these cuts. Coolidge didn't care. And then Hoover gets in and immediately disregards everything he just said and was just kind of waiting to see what would happen instead of trying to let's cut these things off at the past to see if we can fix it. And he didn't.
Today we're examining...
Which I don't know if I could have been better, because how do you cut something off of the past if you don't know which past it's going to be going to, if that makes any sense?
The life of the 31st president, a remarkable man who became a dismal leader. If you were a producer looking for a good rags to riches story to turn into an inspiring movie, you couldn't get much better than the life of Herbert Hoover. Born into a hard-working Quaker family in Iowa on August 10, 1874, Hoover had a tragic childhood, enough to make even the most hardened moviegoer weep. When he was just 6, his blacksmith father died of a heart attack just 10 days before Christmas. Barely 3 years later, in 1884, his mother was killed by typhoid fever. Aged only 9, Hoover became an orphan. To call this a formative moment in the boy's life would be to redefine the meaning of understatement. The death of Hoover's parents devastated the boy. For the rest of his life, he'd be both shy and suspicious of others, while also filled with a powerful drive to succeed, to never again experience the poverty and misery of his orphan years. You could see evidence of this drive in his studies. Eventually settling with an uncle in Oregon, Hoover spent most of his school years as a crappy student. Then in the late 1880s, he suddenly got it into his head that he was going to study at the new elite college opening in California. This was the shiny new campus that everyone had taken to calling the Cornell of the West. To those who didn't know him well, this must have seemed like a mad dream. He was a bad student from an impoverished background, not the type for a place like Stanford. But for those who knew his drive, knew the dark demons propelling him on, they might have guessed what would happen next. That Hoover would work his ass off sticking to a punishing revision schedule, that he'd somehow scrape into Stanford, joining its first ever class. That he'd take 2 part-time jobs and start a student laundry service to pay for his geology degree. That he'd study harder than any of the richer kids there alongside him, with maybe one exception. Lou Henry was a one-woman powerhouse of intelligence, athleticism, and all-round badassery. Stanford's first female geology student, she was every bit as driven as Hoover. You won't be surprised to hear that the young man soon decided to marry her. But first, he needed to make some money. After graduating in 1895, Hoover took back-breaking jobs, working 70 hours a week, hauling ore at gold mines until he could land something more fitting. It took months, but at last he made contact with a company in need of someone to travel the world and examine mines for them to buy. It was the beginning of 2 decades of adventure. Sent to Australia in 1897, Hoover quickly picked up a new contract in China, where he'd be a consultant for the emperor himself. Before he left, Hoover cabled Lou Henry, asking if she'd marry him. We can only assume that Henry's answer was the 19th century equivalent of "F yeah." Herbert Hoover and Lou Henry married in California on February 10, 1899. Their honeymoon was to jump on board a boat to China to start Hoover's new job and their new lives in the Far East. At first, it'd be a great experience. The two would even learn Mandarin, something they'd use whenever they wanted a private conversation for the rest of their lives. But it would also be an experience that came close to ending those same lives. China in 1899 was on the verge of another of its periodic cataclysms, this one an uprising that would specifically target foreigners. Known as the Boxer Rebellion, it would kill 100,000 people in a...
Did you like my trying to show you boxing, probably fighting rebellion, whatever.
matter of weeks. It would also be the making of Herbert Hoover.
He saved people during the Boxer Rebellion as well.
From the safety of the 21st century, the Boxer Rebellion could almost seem funny in its sheer insanity. Led by the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, its soldiers believed they were so ripped that they could deflect bullets. But there was nothing vaguely amusing about being on the receiving end of it. In June 1900, the Boxers attacked major cities, slaughtering and besieging foreigners and Chinese Christians. For Hoover and Liu, caught in modern Tianjin, it was like being in the middle of a full-scale war. Hoover was forced to build barricades to protect their small expat district, marshalling the 800 other foreigners to help with defense. Liu, meanwhile, volunteered to nurse the wounded. It took until August for a coalition of imperial powers to fight its way into China and liberate the besieged cities. Tens of thousands of people died. Yet it wasn't fear Hoover felt during the rebellion, although there was plenty of that. It was responsibility, a dawning realization that he was a good leader in a crisis, someone who could take charge and get things done. While that ability helped save a few hundred lives in the Boxer Rebellion, it would soon be used to save millions. So okay, it's time for our story to take a big leap through time, all the way to 1914. In the near decade and a half we've skipped over, Hoover opened his own mining business, becoming a self-made millionaire. He also found himself a political home, identifying with the progressive wing of the Republican Party. His literal home, however, was thousands of miles away in London, where he lived the charmed life of a wealthy, happy family man. Had he never done anything again, he could have still died knowing that he'd won the game of life. In reality, though, Hoover's life had barely even started. It would take one of the greatest cataclysms of the 20th century to finally kick things into gear. The outbreak of World War I was a domino effect that saw Europe go from being fine, if tense, to screaming quagmire of death within just a few weeks. Some 120,000 American expats and tourists were forced to flee Britain, where they discovered that not only were all the boats to the US cancelled, but they could no longer get money on credit. It was an American refugee crisis, one which could have overwhelmed London had it not been for Herbert Hoover. Along with a few wealthy friends, Hoover set up and coordinated a relief effort for trapped Americans, not only providing them with shelter, but also organising their evacuation. It was such an impressive logistical feat that it brought him to the US ambassador's attention. But when Hoover was called to meet Walter Hines Page, it wasn't to be congratulated. No, Page wanted Hoover to set up an even bigger relief program. By fall 1914, Belgium was on the brink of starvation. Overrun by a brutal German invasion, blockaded by the British Navy, the country's 9 million people were in danger of slipping into famine. Page asked Hoover if he could do anything to help, to do for the Belgians what he'd done for the Americans trapped in London. Hoover picked up that request and ran a goddamn marathon with it. As head of the Commission for Relief in Belgium, or CRB, Hoover took charge of a relief effort unparalleled in history. Some 40,000 volunteers in Belgium had to be coordinated to effectively distribute food to remote villages, while the CRB simultaneously had to maintain a massive international network for sourcing donations. On top of that, Hoover had to negotiate with the British Navy to let his food shipments through the blockade, and with the German military to make sure that they didn't confiscate the supplies. Today we take for granted the existence of charities that do similar stuff on a regular basis, but until the CRB set to work, no one had done anything on a scale like this. At its height, the CRB was feeding approximately 11 million people over an area of 20,000 square miles. It was a barnstorming feat of logistics, an effort that saved untold millions in Belgium from starvation. Incredibly, though, Herbert Hoover was just getting started. Over in America, Hoover's humanitarian work hadn't gone unnoticed. Although there was some talk, unbelievably, of prosecuting him for violating neutrality laws, many powerful people were taking note of the businessman's achievements. Among their number was President Woodrow Wilson. Although Hoover was a Republican, Wilson knew a good man for a job when he saw one, and as the US entered World War I in 1917, Wilson had the perfect job for Hoover: to help the US feed its European allies. By this stage of the war, Britain, France, and Italy were relying on US exports to keep them from starvation. Unfortunately, this was pushing up the price of staples back home, leading Americans to riot at the thought of going hungry just so some random French dude could keep nibbling croissants. It was Hoover's job to sell these shortages to the public. He did better than President Wilson could have dreamed. Under Hoover, the Food Administration pushed the idea that frugal living was patriotic. Meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays became a callback to a time of simpler lives, of the graft and sacrifice that had made America great. So successful was the program that Hoover's name became a common verb. To Hooverize meant to avoid waste. By the time the war ended in November 1918, Hoover was seen by the public as a hero and by Wilson as an organizational genius. And that was no bad thing, because with the war over, Europe was in desperate need of organization. Empires had collapsed, new countries had been born, wars erupted, and economies bottomed out. It was a continent in desperate need of food, clothing, medicine, anything that might make a difference. For Woodrow Wilson, the man to meet those needs was Herbert Hoover. In February 1919, Congress authorized the creation of the American Relief Administration, or ARA. Hoover was given millions of dollars and told to go and save lives, and that's exactly what he did. We can't cover all 20 nations the ARA worked in without turning this video into one long, gratuitous Hoover-ass kiss, but here are a couple of the highlights. In Poland, then fighting a war with Russia, Hoover's ARA was estimated to feed 500,000 children each day, leading to the claim that for the Poles, the name Woodrow Wilson spelled freedom, while the name Herbert Hoover spelled life. Over on the other side of the battle lines, the ARA also organized enough soup kitchens to feed 11 million Russians a day. When critics complained that he was propping up communism, Hoover famously replied, "20 million people are starving. Whatever their politics, they should be fed." So admirable was this attitude that upon hearing of the great humanitarian's work, future rival Franklin D. Roosevelt remarked, "He is certainly a wonder, and I wish we could make him President of the United States. There could not be a better one." But a 1920 Hoover presidential run was not to be. Instead, the Republican nominee that year would be businessman Warren G. Harding, a guy so corrupt his presidency today ranks alongside those of Andrew Johnson and James Buchanan. For non-Americans confused by that reference, just imagine a gigantic turd sat next to two other gigantic turds. The slightly smaller turd with the stupid eyebrows, well, that's Warren Harding. Despite his overall turdiness, Harding did do one smart thing in his only term. Well, technically two smart things, but the second one was more of a fluke. The first was making Hoover his Secretary of Commerce. By now, Hoover's name was synonymous with bounding energy and efficiency.
There's no silent Cal, Calvin Coolidge.
His Secretary of Commerce.
That's his vice
By now,
president.
Hoover's name was synonymous with bounding energy and efficiency. In his new post, the great humanitarian pushed hard on cutting-edge tech like aviation, standardized hardware across industries, and signed off on colossal projects like the Hoover Dam. The second smart thing that Harding did, well, that was dying. In June 1923, Harding hinted to Hoover that his administration might be covering up some sort of scandal. Before it could be exposed, though, Harding died of a heart attack and was replaced by Calvin Coolidge.
Yeah, the Teapot Dome scandal was... Calvin Coolidge was quick to distance himself, which is refreshing in a way because he was not going to sugarcoat what Harding had done.
That meant Coolidge could dump all of the blame on the dead Harding when the Teapot Dome scandal finally erupted, allowing the GOP to survive what would have otherwise been a brutal 1924 election.
And it was Harding. It was Harding. Coolidge was the vice president. He had nothing to do with it. Harding had put a bunch of people in there, and those people were bilking the system.
That's how, come the late 1920s, Herbert Hoover found
That wasn't the Teapot Dome scandal, though. That was just Harding.
himself in a high-profile government position with massive public support under a boss who didn't want another term. In other words, he was perfectly placed to run for president. But it would take more than just name recognition for Hoover to sew up the 1928 nomination. First, he'd have to handle one of the greatest natural disasters in US history. In April 1927, months of rainfall finally overwhelmed the Mississippi River's flood defenses. One by one, levees failed across multiple states, a domino effect of destruction that sent water rolling across farmland, annihilating everything in its path. An area the size of West Virginia was simply washed away, with at least 500 people killed, hundreds of thousands made homeless, and over 750,000 left without access to food. It was the biggest natural disaster of its era, one which demanded an immediate response. It was also Hoover's chance to shine. Although he was a humanitarian by nature, Hoover was not an idiot. He knew that organizing successful disaster relief in spring 1927 might well win him the presidency. So he set to it with manic intensity, charting boats to rescue the stranded, building displaced persons camps, and distributing supplies to everyone who needed them. Well, almost everyone. Ignored by the white majority at the time, who proclaimed Hoover a hero, a scandal erupted when it was revealed that Hoover's men were diverting supplies away from black refugees and sometimes just leaving them stranded. The outrage was so great, it's been said the Mississippi floods represent the moment black voters began to question their allegiance to the GOP, setting the stage for their historic shift toward the Democrats. In 1927, though, the mainstream narrative was that Hoover was a genius, someone who could marshal his skills to overcome any disaster. So when he announced that he was going to run for president, the outcome seemed like a no-brainer. In summer 1928, the great humanitarian was handed his party's nomination. The VP on the ticket was Charles Curtis, the first person with Native American ancestry to reach such high office. Together, the two declared that they'd continue the prosperity of the Coolidge years. Given Hoover's popularity, he could have probably spent the campaign asleep on his sofa and still won. But he threw himself into the task, famously promising a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. For their part, the Democrats put up a sacrificial lamb, New York Governor Alfred E. Smith, a man described by one Hoover-supporting preacher as the candidate of card-playing, cocktail-drinking poodle dogs, divorcees, novels, stuffy rooms, dancing evolution, Clarence Dow, nude art, prize-fighting actors, greyhound racing, and modernism. A little note to self here, start describing my enemies that way. When November finally rolled around, there were no surprises. Hoover crushed it at the polls, taking 58% of the vote, and all but 8 states for an electoral college landslide. At his inauguration on March 4th, 1929, he proclaimed that in no nation are the fruits of accomplishment more secure. Anyone not only can be rich, but ought to be rich. But of course, the economic storm clouds were already gathering. All through the back half of the 1920s, the stock market had soared, divorcing itself from reality in ways that wouldn't be seen again until 2007. In other sections of the economy, chill winds were beginning to blow, the results of structural problems ignored far too long by far too many people. Little did those watching the Hoover inauguration on sound reels across the nation know it, but the Jazz Age, the era of prosperity, Art Deco, flappers, and Gatsby, was about to come crashing to an end. In its place would come an era of uncertainty, unemployment, creeping fascism, and quiet despair. Had Hoover known the cataclysm that awaited, it's just possible he might have wished Alfred Smith had won after all. No matter who was in charge when the Great Depression hit, it would have ended their presidency. Over the coming years, unemployment would leap from barely 3% to nearly a quarter of the workforce. GDP would...
And I just would like to point out that when FDR gets nominated and wins on the next election, hold on. Okay, so what I was saying was, when FDR gets into office, he is still initiating the same policies that Herbert Hoover was using to try to stop the Great Depression just from really kicking in. And it just wasn't working. But FDR was following the same thing. He just got lucky for two things. One, sorry, it's my chair. When Hoover would do something, Hoover would throw something out. And it might slow it down. And he was like, good, we're just going to wait. And then it would finally not work and the depression would start to hit again. And they were like, okay, now what can we do? FDR was like, we're going to throw 5 things at the wall and see what happens. It slowed it down. Cool. What worked? Well, seems to work. Cool. Now let's throw 5 more things at the wall. Now he's throwing more things. He's getting the same results. It's just not working. He was a little more proactive in what they were throwing in terms of Hoover, who was kind of a wait and see. But if you flip their places and the war happens, World War II, Hoover is looked at as FDR and FDR is looked at as Hoover. The war is what brought us out. Lend-Lease, all the money from sales, getting the production of the war effort pretty much running. That's what saved us. It wasn't FDR's policies. So, trying to be fair to Hoover, it also wasn't his policies that got us into the Great Depression. It was policies beforehand that just weren't checked, as he said.
Crater, dropping 30%. By the end of Hoover's term, thousands of banks would have collapsed, 20% of all farms closed, and the nation would be hemorrhaging 100,000 jobs a week. Those numbers are so bad, their only parallel is the absolute peak of the 2020 COVID crisis, and even then, things eased off in a matter of months, rather than staying that way for years. So yeah, any averagely competent president would have been absolutely screwed. Sadly, Hoover wasn't even average. There were warning signs in the handful of pre-crash moments that Hoover's genius at disaster relief hadn't translated very well to the presidency. He seemed unable to work with Congress. He floundered over a couple of important bills, failed to communicate with a public that still adored him. Had Hoover become president during a boom, he might have been able to coast, to go down as an okayish leader, the sort of inoffensive president everyone struggles to remember when doing quizzes. But then came October 1929, and Hoover's fate was sealed. Although the Wall Street crash is today heralded as the clearest start point for the Great Depression, at the time it was just considered another slump. Hoover's advisors basically shrugged and told him there was nothing he could do, but for all his faults, the 31st president wasn't content to simply stand by and wait. That November, Hoover convened conferences between big businesses and organized labor and won important agreements to avoid layoffs and strikes. Separately, he leaned on states to authorize new public works projects to boost employment. He even cut taxes to stimulate spending. Ever since he left office, people have liked to portray Hoover as an American Nero, someone who fiddled while the country burned. But that's simply not true. No, the real tragedy of Hoover's presidency is that he tried his best to tackle the crisis, but a combination of his political beliefs and a failure to grasp the Depression's magnitude meant he was forever 20 steps behind events. That December, despite Hoover's efforts, 1 million Americans lost their jobs in the week before Christmas. From there on, things would only get worse. As 1930 got...
One thing to remember is Calvin Coolidge and his people were cutting all these programs, which kind of triggered the slide into the what would have they thought was going to be recession. Hoover, it's hard to say, okay, disregard all the cuts, because Coolidge was trying to pay down the deficit, which is a great idea. Don't get me wrong. We apparently don't even care about doing that anymore. Great idea. We should do it. Coolidge was trying to pay down the deficit. Hoover can't step in and say, okay, forget everything he did. Now he closed a bunch of things. He canceled a bunch of programs. He canceled a bunch of organizations. Let's refire it all back up. You can't just start it back up as fast as you can cancel it. You can cancel it quickly. You can get rid of it pretty fast. It's hard to get everything back into place and running again like a smooth engine. It doesn't work that way. And so Hoover couldn't just cancel a lot of those things and restart programs. He found out, oh no, those doors are shuttered. And in order to get them open, we have to restart everything, which could take months, even though it took weeks to pretty much cancel the budget and fire everyone. So that was another thing. And I'm not trying to stick up for Hoover. I'm just trying to be fair in judging him.
Underway, the president launched initiative after failed initiative to try and help the economy. He pushed through a tariff act intended to give struggling farmers a captive market, only for the act to kneecap American imports and exports and hurt the wider economy. He set up an emergency committee to coordinate unemployment relief, but refused to authorize direct payments or welfare. He pleaded with the states to fund more infrastructure to generate jobs, but backed off from forcing through federal bills that would guarantee the same. Meanwhile, the breadlines just kept getting longer. By the end of the year, with unemployment closing in on 10%, parts of Congress began begging Hoover to get the government involved, to bring in a dole or experiment with direct relief. But Hoover refused. As a man who'd pulled himself out of an impoverished childhood via his own grit and hard work, he simply couldn't see why others couldn't do the same. At his core, Hoover believed that America was a great nation filled with kindly individuals, people who would help their fellow man without the need for government intervention. But that America was dead. It was killed by the crash. In its place was a land ravaged by hunger, by despair, by people desperate for help. They couldn't get any from the great humanitarian. By 1931, vast shanty towns were cropping up on the outskirts of cities as the newly destitute were evicted from their homes. The public soon settled on a name for these makeshift encampments, one which summed up their feelings towards the unfeeling man in the White House. They called them Hoovervilles. The final year of Hoover's presidency was marked by PR catastrophes so incendiary they did for his reputation what the Hindenburg did for airship travel. The year actually got off to a good start, with Hoover signing the Emergency Relief Construction Act, which put aside $2 billion for public works. But any good that bill did was swiftly swamped by two utterly tone-deaf moments. The first was when Hoover suddenly decided to implement a national sales tax. The thinking behind this sort of makes sense if you squint a little. Hoover wanted to raise taxes to keep the deficit down, but he didn't want to overburden the rich who he saw as wealth creators. But, well, the optics of that are really bad. No longer did Hoover look out of touch, he now looked like a man snatching the last pennies out of starving Americans' pockets. The outcry was so bad that Hoover backed down, but not before the damage had been done. However, it was the second PR blunder that would end his humanitarian reputation once and for all. In the summer of 1932, a large gang of out-of-work World War I veterans descended on Washington, D.C. They had bonus payments due in 1945 and were agitating to get them paid now, like when they actually needed the cash, not in 13 years' time when they all might be dead of starvation. Known as the Bonus Army, they were a nightmare for the White House, especially when some of them started occupying empty federal buildings. So Hoover asked General Douglas MacArthur to evict them. MacArthur responded, by unleashing hell. MacArthur's soldiers attacked the bonus army with tear gas and guns. Their tents were burned, tanks were rolled in, one destitute veteran was killed. These were men who'd risked their lives for the United States, and now here they were, being driven like rats from the Capitol simply for daring to demand better. No matter that MacArthur had resorted to violence on his own initiative, no matter that Hoover privately deplored the rampage. In the minds of Americans, Hoover was now indelibly linked with images of state brutality. There's little point going into the details of Hoover's campaign for re-election. Nobody thought he was going to win a second term. The real action was happening in the Democratic Party, where Franklin D. Roosevelt was promising a New Deal to help get the nation back on track. By the time November rolled around, voting for Hoover was about as appetizing as drinking a bowl of dog vomit. In the end,
Just want to point out the New Deal that FDR was pushing was very similar to the Square Deal that his cousin Teddy Roosevelt had pushed.
only 6 states went Republican. In the popular vote, Hoover didn't even break 40%, worse than even Jimmy Carter in 1980. Still, with new presidents at that time inaugurated in March, that left Hoover 5 months left in office. 5 months in which he tried to coordinate a crisis response with FDR, only to be rebuffed. For the rest of his life, a bitter Hoover would be convinced FDR deliberately let him flounder to tank his reputation. Not that anyone needed convincing that Hoover was a bad president. When Herbert Hoover left office on March 4th, 1933, his name was Toxic, a shorthand for shantytowns, breadlines, crushing poverty, and backbreaking despair. Although he'd live another 31 years, dying on October 20th, 1964, America never forgave him. To this day, Hoover ranks in surveys of historians as among the worst US presidents. Maybe not quite up to Warren Harding's turdiness, but a far cry from his successor. Yet only to focus on Hoover's disastrous single term would be to miss the broader picture of his life. Here was a man who worked himself up from poverty, from an orphaned upbringing, to being one of the most successful businessmen of his day. That done, he didn't just sit on his arse and count his dough, but he used his money, his connections, and his superhuman organizational skills to literally save millions of lives. In private, too.
Truman called on him for World War II, and he fed Russians and stuff like that. And they were known to, the kids were known to have Hoover lunches, which was a piece of meat, a potato, a vegetable, and milk. I think there were 5 things though. Oh, and bread. Yeah. So you had a piece of bread, a cut of meat, some fruit, a potato. Did I already say that? And then a milk. Yeah. I think the adults were fed, but maybe only 1 meal a day. And the kids, I think, had 2. Potentially 3 for World War II, but I'll stick with 2. And there are people I've talked to overseas that, their grandparents remember having a Hoover lunch.
He was humble. From the moment he became Secretary of Commerce, Hoover gave his salary away to charity, a practice he kept up all through his presidency. He was, in other words, a great man. Had he died in 1928, he'd now be remembered as one of America's great philanthropists, rather than one of its greatest disappointments. Maybe it says something about the way we remember our leaders that Hoover's inspiring first decades are now forgotten. Maybe it suggests we need a whole new way of ranking presidents, one with a separate section for those who, like Jimmy Carter decades later, were crappy presidents, but also great
Jimmy Carter?
men. Because make no mistake, Hoover was both those things. If researching this video has taught us anything, it's that Hoover deserves to be remembered not as Herbert Hoover, failed president, but also Herbert Hoover, the man who saved millions. So I really hope you found this video interesting. If you did,
Yeah, I think I talked enough during this video, but yeah, I have a more positive view on Hoover. But I mean, he failed as a president, but I won't judge his life based on the presidency. People know I like Andrew Jackson. Love Andrew Jackson's life. Hate his presidency. I don't judge him, though, by that presidency. So I can't judge Hoover by his presidency. Hoover overall, hard worker, achieved a lot in his life, a great humanitarian. Didn't have a good 4 years. Went on to continue to be a great humanitarian. And I think it's things like that, you should remember the person, maybe not necessarily the presidency, but the person is important. Well, anyways, I'm going to end that here. Hope you enjoyed. And until next time, have a good day. Have a good night.